They leak water, they leak soil, both in wind and water erosion, nutrients, biocides. They're not profitable for most farmers in most years now. They leak carbon dioxide, methane, and they're causing loss of biodiversity in many regions. They also leak young people. If you look at the census data for the last 2 or 3 censuses, it's very clear. In particular, the cohort of females from 15 to 24 is leaving the bush, and that is demographically one of the most important cohorts. So we're losing talented young people out of rural Australia. That is a very worrying sign in terms of of developing smarter land use systems in the future. However, most of the degradation occurs in specific events. It might be in a flood, a fire or a drought. We call them extreme, we shouldn't call them unexpected. We still have drought policies that talk about exceptional circumstances, which are supposed to be based on 1 in 25-year events. And there are areas that have had that declared now 7 years in a row. So they've had 1 in 25-year events 7 years in a row, which suggests they're probably not 1 in 25 anymore. It's clear by now that broadacre land clearing is no longer tenable, especially along rivers and streams, and yet we're still taking a long time to get that under control. And the water use on farms needs to be smarter. The biggest issue from where I sit in Australian agriculture is the gap between the best and the average, and then the gap between the average and the tail. So let's just take irrigation water use efficiency, and here are different sectors. You'll see the lowest water use, that's the most efficient in the left-hand column in megalitres per hectare, and the highest water use in megalitres per hectare in the right-hand column. And you'll see there's usually a factor of at least 3 between the most efficient and the least efficient. That's a huge gap. And narrowing that gap is where you can find enormous water savings in irrigation. So in dairy it's nearly 3-fold, in peach and nectar stone fruit it's over 3-fold. It's only twice in pears, twice in maize, 3 times in citrus, 3 times in cotton. So there's a huge scope there. That suggests you can divide your water use by a factor of 3 if you can just get the bottom up to where the top are now. And then a lot of our problems would have disappeared. But when you think about what sort of farming systems we need, and this is something I took up at Mount Canobolas at Orange last week or the week before, ideally, if you're starting again from a clean sheet of paper for Australian conditions, you'd want systems that are diverse, resilient, buffered, i.e. that they can handle a bad year, that they anticipate that bad season, that they're responsive and opportunistic, i.e. much like a lot of our native flora and fauna. We want them to be tuned to a variable climate. I know a couple who live out of Coonabarabran on a wheat sheep property, and they have a unit in Coffs Harbour, and their policy is that whenever they get a drought, they stockpile grain in the good years, they just bury it with a bulldozer, they bury it in a big pit lined with plastic on their farm. Whenever they get a drought, they employ a young local bloke to just gradually feed the grain out of that pit to their stock, to the breeders that they keep, and they just repair to Coffs Harbour for the duration. And they call it sabbatical, and they get really disappointed if they don't get a decent drought every 5 to 7 years or so. So clearly they've had a good time for the last 5, they must have been in Coffs now for quite a while. But
will they eventually go bankrupt?
No, provided they make enough money in the good years, and in that system they don't lose money in those bad years because they don't have to sell all their breeders and they don't have to buy in feed because they've stockpiled it. So, but there are a couple that are middle-aged with no debt. A younger couple just starting out, or someone just starting out in agriculture that's had to borrow a lot of money, would have difficulty instituting that sort of system. So that's the challenge from a policy point of view. how to ensure that talented people can hang on, the people who need to be adjusted out get adjusted out. We need systems to actually be much more profitable so that you can get out of debt. And when I say much more profitable, I don't mean 10% more profitable. I mean twice as profitable using half the water and half the energy. Radically different performance benchmarks than what we have now. And producing a new suite of products, including carbon, including biofuels, including water as a product where appropriate. So there are good efficient irrigators who've made good money on the water spot market in recent years by selling their water. And that's been a higher return to them than growing a risky crop. And we need farming systems that are integrated into regional economies so that they can and meet the lifestyle aspirations of those communities, so they can attract good people.
I see, sorry, just on that previous slide, I see the speed limit sign in the middle of the paddock there. Was that significant, Andrew?
No.
It's an allegorical.
I only saw that later. So when I was standing there with the camera, it hadn't occurred to me. But if you think about our existing farming systems, and this is taken from the kitchen window of my farm in Western Victoria, they're not generally tuned to our conditions. And here's what two old farmers have told me about it. One old bloke in Queensland during a drought in the early 90s said to me, "Mate, if we discovered England, do you reckon we'd have gone and shot all the sheep and cattle and cleared all the oak forests and gone and grazed in the kangaroos?" Because that's exactly what's happened in Australia. And that was his point. He said, "I don't reckon that's that smart." But that's what happened here. And another young bloke in Western Australia who shore sheep for 10 years to make enough money to go out and buy a wheat property and become a boss rather than a shearer. And after about 10 years of trying to farm the country, this was his reflections. "I'm sick and tired of trying to keep alive animals and plants that just want to die in this country, while shooting and clearing animals and plants that are adapted to it and just want to live in this country." And that was how he described his farming system. That was his definition of his farming system. "I'm trying to keep alive animals and plants that just want to die, while shooting and clearing animals and plants that just want to live." And he's now out of agriculture. And quite depressed. So if you want to change anything, there are three big conditions in my opinion. People must want to change, but they need to have viable things to change to, and they need to have the means to get from A to B. So wanting to change is commitment. That's influenced by a sense of place and of community. You need to have viable and adoptable options, and you need to have the capacity to change. You can influence capacity a little bit at the margins with incentives or whatever. You can influence commitment with disincentives and incentives and so on. You can obviously change know-how through investments in research and extension, but this gives rise to a policy menu. But if you think, and that's one of the demonstration farms that I worked on in the mid-1980s in Western Victoria. But if you think about the adoption is not about fostering children, it's about getting people to adopt new practices. So it's a term used in agricultural extension. Dave Pannell and colleagues have gone back and looked at 50 years of adoption literature and found that the rules haven't changed. Those economic and regulatory signals remain weak, and you're going to get widespread on-farm change when innovations, one, are better than the status quo, two, are not too complex, three, they can be trialled or tested or evaluated, preferably on just a part of the farm, so you don't have to change the whole farm just to try something out and then find it didn't work.